So, it is now just 5 days before History Paper 1. Man, I am beginning to feel like the pressure now. What we have done over the last couple of streams is we have fully revised Theme 2. So we've gone over welfare provision, health provision, and education provision. Which I'm happy that we've gone over that because not only are the exam questions for that pretty easy, but the topic itself is pretty easy. So what I want to do for the first 20 minutes of this stream is go back over all of Theme 2, just to make sure we know everything. Then I want to start revising Theme 3, and hopefully by Tuesday we'll have that completely revised. Then it's just a matter of time to get Theme 4 finished, get some questions on that done, and then we go over the Margaret Thatcher topic on Thursday. So, let me actually just quickly put Sunday to Monday, Tuesday to Wednesday, and Thursday. So, we will start off by going over all of our Theme 2s. So I'm going to kind of draw it like this, with our provision here, health here, and education here. And we're going to divide this up into the interwar years, World War II, and post-World War II. And this is going to allow us to compare all of the different legislation, everything like that. So, let's crack on, shall we? I've bought a load of new pens, that's why everything looks a bit thin, but yeah, let's crack on. So, in terms of welfare provision in the interwar years, we have, of course, the national insurance. Oh, that's a bad colour. I'll find another colour. We have the National Insurance Act. Now, the National Insurance Act in the interwar years is incredibly limited. It's £160 a year, but it is limited to very specific industries. We also have the Unemployment Insurance Act. This act enabled 2/3 of employees to receive unemployment benefits. Then there is the Unemployment Act, which gave about 14 million workers 26 paid weeks off work. We also had the Local Authorities Act. And this act was what introduced means testing. So that is everything in terms of the interwar years for welfare provision. We could also add a couple social things here. For example, means testing led to hunger marches. Oh my, this is such a diluted pen, what? Huh, okay, I guess we'll just live with it. So yeah, those are all of the acts for the interwar years. Unemployment insurance gave 2/3 of workers unemployment benefits. Basically a step up from the National Insurance Act. The Unemployment Act gave millions of workers paid weeks off, which was essential during the Depression. Local Authority Act was a limit because it meant that means testing was a thing, led to hunger marches. The original National Insurance Act was not beneficial at all. Only a select few industries were helped. Contrastingly, we have the National Insurance Act in the welfare state. This is where you paid 5% of your weekly earnings, and this was for things like pensions, unemployment, maternity, and sick pay. The limitations to this act was that it did not include people who were married women, or the self-employed. Also, 5% was quite a lot of money, and pensions were limited. The other acts during World War II, or I guess World War II is more of just a cluster term to define like the years after the war as well, the welfare state. We have the Family Allowance Act, which is where women who had 2 or more children were paid directly. This being a huge turning point not only for the status of women, which we'll get into later today, but the Family Allowance Act was just essential overall because it helped women whose husbands had been killed during the war. And finally is the National Assistance Act. This act, I believe, gave financial aid to those who needed it. It was not universal, but it also was non-means tested. So that's a bit of a step up from means testing. No more means testing. The National Insurance Act clearly has some massive changes. The National Insurance Act further changes in the post-World War II, the 60s, where 100,000 are on benefits. Sorry, not benefits, pensions. 100,000 are added to the pensions list who previously did not have access. Now, the limitations to the post-World War II is the New Right movement. The New Right movement believed that there was an over-dependence on benefits, and this impacted the economy. Also, social views were different. Social views were no longer collectivist. So the generation that was during the war was collectivist, which is what incentivized the government to want to play a larger role in the welfare state. However, this newer generation focused on non-collectivist because they opposed high taxes. And obviously, when Britain accepted the IMF loan, it cut spending of welfare. It cut welfare spending. So there are growing, negatives post-World War II. Then we move on to health. And I'm trying to remember the acts. Okay, health. In terms of health, we have hospitals. A majority are voluntary. The only good ones are teaching hospitals, which are in London. It was this idea that about 70% of health was private, or of doctors were private. And it was this idea that some efforts were made. The Local Authorities Act basically gave the role of the hospitals to the local governments. Local gov given some authority. So 70% of doctors were private, mainly the middle class. Also, the National Insurance Act did not include women or children health. So that should be a red. And only major industries were allowed this healthcare. So overall, in the interwar years, health is very bad. Hospitals are mainly voluntary, which means they're poor quality, limited. The teaching hospitals, the best quality, are restricted to London only. 70% of doctors are private, which means they mostly reside in middle class areas. The National Insurance Act is incredibly limited. Women and children are not given health, and only major industries. And Local Authorities Act gives some authority of the hospitals over to the local government. Then we move into World War II, where you have things like the Emergency Medical Service, which attempts to centralise everything. Centralise doctors, hospitals, etc., as a response to the Blitz. The Emergency Medical Service combined with the Beveridge Report, which suggested the Beveridge Report sold a lot of copies. Also want to talk about the wartime government of Attlee, Bevan, which gave them experience. The Beveridge Report acted basically as the foundation for the welfare state. Also things like rationing and evacuee programs highlighted the massive limit to people. I should also add here in the interwar years, many, like in the interwar years, right after World War One, where about 40% were too unfit to fight. So, the Emergency Medical Service attempted to centralise healthcare as a response to the Blitz. The Beveridge Report sold millions of copies, promoting the 5 evils of Britain, factors like rationing, and the idea of it being a total war. Obviously, the wartime government, with Attlee and Bevan, they had experience, and this led into Bevan, who created an ambitious deadline for the NHS. About 90% of the public signed up. He fed them out. I don't remember the thing. It was stuffing their mouths with gold. Basically, the direct opposition to the NHS was the Conservative government and the what was it called? The doctor thing. The British Medical Association, where most doctors did not sign up. Most doctors did not sign up for the NHS because they wouldn't keep their private fees, private patients. So Bevan had to compromise by allowing them to get salaries and continue with private patients. So in an exam question, you could get asked a significant bunch about Bevan, his impact on creating the NHS. Obviously, he would be a massive agree, you know, the whole thing of him setting a deadline, getting the public signed up and ready, opposing the Conservative opposition. Obviously, the British Medical Association, stuffing their mouths with gold and getting the doctors on board just months before. Then we talk about the limitations to the NHS. Primarily, well, there's some good, there's some bad. The bad is that things like spectacles and dentistry became costly, they costed actual money, which led to Bevan resigning. Also, this idea that it was more curative and less preventative meant that rising costs, also an over-dependence on the NHS, led to the dandruff effect. So those are the limitations to the NHS. Mainly, some things did begin to cost money, leading to Bevan resigning. There was a focus on curative instead of preventative medicine. The good parts are obviously immunisation programs, eradicated some diseases. The idea that infant mortality drops, lifespan increases. But of course, there are disadvantages to the NHS. So that is everything so far. I'm gonna have to ship this down a tad now. Now we move on to education. Now education is arguably the easiest, but there is a slight overlap between education and university education. So let's look at this. Firstly is the 1902 and 1918 Education Act. The 1902 Act attempts to make 25% of people in grammar schools non-paying. It fails as only 5% end up being non-paying. The way they did this is they just paid grammar schools to try and accept non-paying students. The 1918 Act is more significant. This is also called the Fisher Education Act. This is significant for many reasons. The school leaving age is put to 14. Nurseries are built or created, and it scraps elementary fees. So that's a significant change. Also, we have the Haddo Report, which is what inspires the Butler Act. Or I guess acts as a foundation for the Butler Act. Also, so the Haddo Act suggested things like raising the school leaving age, introducing a tripartite system, things like that. But it was deemed too expensive at the time, which is why it was delayed until the Butler Education Act. We also have things like the Barlow and Percy reports, which try to expand the amount of students in universities, which was also accommodated by the Butler Act. So the Butler Act was introduced by Labour Minister R.A. Butler. It introduced the tripartite system. Tripartite system is grammar, modern, and technical. Each one of these has their own massive limitations. For example, grammar schools are limited because of the 11+. The 11+ exam determined which one of these secondary schools you got into. The 11+ favoured middle-class children, and there was no parity between modern and grammar. which meant that modern schools were very lacking. It led to factory fodder, because most of a modern education was just general education. You would go on to work a shit factory job. Comparatively, grammar schools taught a formal education, which would lead on to things like university. And finally, technical schools, there were only about 5 of these because it was very costly, but they did teach things like engineering, mechanical education. The Butler Act overall was good because it tried to introduce a formal form of education, and it was a free form of education. It was limited because of a tripartite system, which is where you then move on to the issues with the 11 plus exam, leading to the Crosland Circular, which suggested comprehensive education. And by the end of this time period, 1979, there are about 90% of schools adopting comprehensive education. Just gonna... So there's about 90% adopting. There are some limitations here. Again, just like the NHS, there's some limitations to comprehensive. The limitations being the Plowden report and a decline in grammar schools. The Plowden report suggested that there was a massive drop in standards of teaching due to like trendy teaching, which was seen as a massive disadvantage. Also, around that same time, there was public, hysteria because there was a drop in grammar schools, which, everyone thought, oh my god, like, the nation's fucked. The positives were, there were things like Ofsted. The leaving age was raised to 16, and there was a national curriculum. Oh, the Butler Act raised the school leaving age to 15 as well. So 14, 15, 16. In terms of university, you had the Robbins report. Robbins report doubled the number of universities and led to the Open University. Also, in terms of universities, this is a massive one, is tech schools, polytech schools could award degrees, which increased the number of people taking vocational studies. So, holy shit. That right there is literally, I have spent 20 minutes going over this? That is all of Theme 2. Everything you could ever want on Theme 2, I have just done it. I don't think I've missed an act, or if I have, it clearly can't be an important act. Man, okay. Give me a sec, guys. Give me a breather. Then we'll crack on with Theme 3. You know what? I will take a photo. You won't be able to read this if I take a screenshot, but I'll just... So. Should I very quickly go over this again, just so it's in my head? I'm going to actually have to move a tripod back here. My God, okay. So. Man, okay. I guess I'll just tell people to click on at 25. So, In terms of welfare provision, it's divided into the interwar years, welfare state, World War Two, and then post-World War Two. Welfare provision starts off a little bit shaky. The National Insurance Act is very limited. Only a select few industries had national insurance, and it was limited to £160 a year. We had some good parts. The Unemployment Insurance Act meant that 2/3 of workers got unemployment insurance. The Unemployment Act gave half a year of paid leave to millions of workers, but then we have our limitation, which is the Local Authorities Act. This act introduced means testing, where every 6 months you had to get means tested if you wanted benefits. This was so controversial that you had things like hunger marches happening. Then we move on to World War II, the welfare state, where the National Insurance Act is far greater. In fact, hold up. What I want to do quickly, I want to take just a sec. You know what? We won't go over it. If I want to, I'll just send the stream link to people and tell them to watch from, 2 minutes in to however long in, 24 minutes. So, that is everything. I am so happy with this. To be honest, I'm so happy. This looks cool as hell. It's a shame that I have to get rid of this. I wish I had like a digital whiteboard where I could just swipe to a new page and come back to this. But we are going to have to move on now to changes in class structure. And then we will also go on to the Liberal Society, and that's where we'll wrap it up for today. Changes in class structure. Because to be honest, I know a lot about this, but I can't answer exam questions on it particularly well. Okay. In fact, my Liberal Society question was literally, I got like 80% on that. I got 90% for my race relation question, which highlights that I probably need to revise this more if I'm only getting like 80%. Not that 80%'s bad, I just mean like, clearly if I'm dropping a handful of marks on this, I want to be aiming for better. So, again, we will do this exactly how we did last time. Start with the upper class. Moving on to the middle class. Then finally, the working class. And we will divide it this time up as well. So we'll look at the interwar years. Or basically the impact of World War One. In fact, no, I don't think we should divide it up, because we can do that at a later point. Okay. So, I will just see how much of this I can remember on my own, and then we'll crack on, look at the document. So, to begin with, 1/5 of upper class peers die. This is because a majority of the upper class fought in the war, because about 40% of the working class were too sick to fight. So 1/5 died during the war, and after the war, they face higher death duties and taxes, which leads to 20% or 25%, 25% of gentry land becomes sold by 1920. So already, some significant losses for the upper class. A fifth of them die, and 25% of gentry land becomes sold in 1920 due to the high taxes, high death duties post-war. In terms of political impact, Representation of the People Act means that there are more working class / Labour ministers. There's also changes to the Houses of Lords, where they replace life peers, and they make it so that it's no longer based on ancestry. No longer based on ancestry. So there is a slight decline in terms of the political impact of the upper class. However, when it comes to Macmillan's government, is it Macmillan? What was the conservative guy? Not Heath. Is it MacDonald or Macmillan? Ramsay MacDonald was Labour. What am I thinking? Macmillan. When it comes to Macmillan's government, it is more of a focus now on the new upper class. And most of Macmillan's government consisted of the new upper class, showing that there wasn't really a political decline. Obviously, with the upper class, you had things like the perfumer affair, which massively damaged the deference, the respect put on the upper class. Also, things like the rise of satire. Obviously, that led to Macmillan quitting, or resigning, citing poor health. So, in terms of the upper class, a fifth of them died during World War I. High death duties, 25% of gentry land is sold. This highlights a significant impact on the upper class, the decline of the upper class. The Representation of the People Act further damages this, as working class MPs or Labour MPs are now a thing, and in the House of Lords, life peers are removed. It's no longer a focus on ancestry. However, it can be argued that there's a bit of a limitation to that, because Macmillan's government did have the new upper class, but obviously you had things like the perfumer affair. So obviously with this one, you want to be talking about how there was a massive decline in the upper class, primarily due to the impact of World War I, but also due to political advancements and the rise of deference. But also, of course, you also want to talk about how that's only to an extent. In terms of the middle class, this is more to do with homeowning, and the idea that 40% owned homes. You want to talk about how they similarly to the upper class had things like saving accounts affected because of the war. You want to talk about how in terms of the middle class, it was a rise of jobs. That includes like clerking jobs for women, but also professional jobs in terms of, science, technology, things like that. I don't remember much else for the middle class. Middle class is more of just a rise in homeowning. The savings were affected, which highlights a limitation to the growth of the middle class, but overall there is a massive rise of jobs. You could talk about the tension between the middle class and the working class due to unions. The middle class blamed the unions for their lack of savings, lack of money. In terms of the working class, 40% are too sick to fight during World War One, which does place a greater focus on the working class. Also, the rise of unions, and I don't remember an exact number, but then post-war, unions decline. You have things like in the welfare state, the industrial injuries acts, which is a massive change in terms of worker rights, worker freedoms, and that is everything that I can remember off the top of my head. Clearly I'm missing a lot there, so I'll go pull out my laptop and we will go take a quick look at the changes in class. And then before we go, we should probably plan 1 or 2 essays, and then when I finish this stream, I will crack on with an essay. What is the time? We've only been live for 37 minutes, that's crazy. Oh, and it's only 1:15, so literally, if I spend another 10 minutes live now, but we need to go over race relations as well. Or should we go over liberal society and then that be it for today? Let's have a look. Upper class. CO. Reduce influence. Aha, some statistics. That's what we forgot. Statistics and data. The main one you want to talk about is how 40% to 50%. So, 40% to 50% of MPs owned land. So a massive decline in the Etonian influence. The middle class, World War One, led to a 34% increase in jobs or employment. Which is significant. Middle class often blamed working class and unions. 60% owned houses compared to 20%. So that is 60% compared with 20% of middle class. That's all for middle class. Working class, 31% could not fight due to being too sickly. Union membership doubled, but after the war it began to decline. Rationing, of course, rationing improved their health. Rationing improves health, increased lifespan. World War II led to full employment in the old industries. It impacted because of a welfare state, which obviously we can link back to the middle class, who were able to afford private doctors / hospitals. dissolution of class boundaries due to a consumerism society, and the growth of disposable income. So that is everything in terms of the changing class values, or changing of classes in general. Basically, the upper class has a little bit of a wobble because of World War One heavily impacting. So if we got an exam question, let's plan this now. If we got an exam question saying, the question was like, oh, what was the impact of... How accurate is it to say that war was the most leading factor for changing class values? You could say, yeah, absolutely. In World War One, it impacts the upper class. It leads to employment of the middle class, but it also does affect the middle class. In terms of the working class, it improves their health thanks to rationing. It doubles the unions. You could talk about a bit of a limitation there. Then another one would be talking about World War II, the impact of a welfare state. But then you could also talk about how actually it was political influence. How in terms of the upper class, their class values change because of politics. You could talk about how, realistically that would be your argument. Number one, World War One, its impact. Number two, World War Two and its impact, / welfare and its impact. And then finally you could talk about number three, the political impact and the idea that more MPs didn't own land. So that is everything right there. Now, my revision document goes on to talk about the liberal society. I don't think we need to go over the liberal society. We could probably get all of Theme 3 done, you know. Shit, we could. We probably could, you know. Oh my god. Oh yeah. Call me damned, we might actually get this done. So that was changing class boundaries. Let's quickly just go over that so it sticks in. The most important statistics there is going to be home ownership, 60% compared to 20%, lower class. Talking about a fifth of peers dying at war, a quarter of gentry land being sold by 1920. In fact, I'm not gonna... You know what we'll do? I was gonna do race relations. Race relations is a monster of a topic. I have a better idea. I have like one lesson tomorrow maybe, or two. My better idea is, why not tomorrow? Okay, hold on. I'm going to plan this out now. Because we need to plan this out genuinely. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Monday, we will go over race relations. Tuesday, we will go over living standards. And we'll do some exam questions. Wednesday, we'll go over leisure and do some exam questions on that. And on Thursday, that is when we'll go over Thatcher, and we will look at the mark scheme content for that. So, in terms of now, what I'm going to do is we'll go over the liberal society, then I will find and do tonight 2 exam questions. I'm yet to do one on the NHS. I'm yet to do one on the impact of war on classes. Yet to do one on social values. So we could do that. I'm going to save the entertainment stuff for Tuesday night when we go over that. So, let's quickly go over the liberal society. This is going to be way easier. It's acts, opposition, and also just general events. Your events are going to be things like the Perfumer affair, where an MP was caught having an affair with a sex worker. This led to a rise of deference, including Macmillan resigning. Events are going to be things like the coined sexual revolution, and the idea that the sexual revolution was highly exaggerated, including things like marriage, but we'll get onto that in a sec. Let's actually look at the acts. Most notable ones: the Abortion Act, the Sexual Offences Act, the Murder Act, the Divorce Reform Act, and the Obscene Publications Act. So, the limitations. Abortion Act was significant because it provided... Oh, and also the PIL, the Family Planning Act. I guess we'll just put those hand in hand. Both of these are significant because it provided abortions / the pill via the NHS, which is greater freedoms for women. Greater sexual freedoms. The limitation is that the guy that introduced this, his name is David Steele. When David Steele proposed the Abortion Act, he focused on the number of deaths due to backstreet abortions instead of the actual moral issue, which suggests, a slight limitation there. So he focused on death statistics, but overall it's a legalization of abortion. Divorce reform is the idea that divorce, it gave freedoms to women. In 1948, divorce rates peaked, but then they fell after that. So it's this idea that women did have greater freedoms, but it might have been exaggerated. Greater freedoms for women, but limitations of a liberal society's reach. So yeah. Sex Offences Act is this idea that homosexuality, soliciting, so it was this idea that you were allowed to be homosexual in private, but if you did it in public, you could be arrested for soliciting, which actually increased the number of arrests for homosexual couples. And a major one here is this, the idea that people only accepted this act, so it was accepted by the public, but only because they saw being gay as a disease and something that they wanted to cure. So it took away from the seriousness of homosexuality, like the campaigning, which had been going on since 1890. So it did take away from the significance. It was a great freedom, but not the best. The Murder Act was incredibly controversial, mainly due to the Moores murders that happened just a year after. Most of the public did not want this. But many MPs did due to the campaigning. Due to the heavy amount of campaigning that happened. And yeah, the Moores murders were incredibly controversial. People wanted them to be executed, but obviously the Murder Act was passed. Finally, the Obscene Publications Act allowed sexual content such violence in terms of works of art, and eventually this was passed on to cinema such theatre work as well. And this obviously increased deference. Then in terms of the limitations to the liberal society, there's some good ones. The Perfumer affair heavily impacted deference, led to Macmillan resigning. The idea that the sexual revolution was likely over-exaggerated by the media. You also just want to talk about the idea that most MPs supported these liberal laws, while the public did not. So that's a huge limitation. Also just the idea that many more, traditional towns didn't accept these liberal values at all. Also talking about Roy Jenkins here. He's the guy that approved them. In terms of opposition, you have one, Whitehouse. Mary Whitehouse strongly opposed the liberal society. She's the woman that I remember because of Family Guy, where she opposed sex and violence on TV. She created the something, the NVLA, that's a complicated name. She created the NVLA, which had, I think, 100,000 members. Yes, 100,000 members who opposed this. Who opposed sex and violence on TV, so heavy opposition. She was able to pass the... what's it called? I don't want to cheat. What's it called? What's the act called? Fuck, I'm gonna have to cheat. Indecency. Indecent Displays Act. So she was a Christian school teacher. She ended up, because of her campaigning, passing an act. However, overall her influence was limited. Mainly because she did not advertise at all, and she exaggerated her reach. But Mary Whitehouse did highlight a massive limitation to the liberal society in terms of many opposing the sex and violence on TV, which had grown. So, overall, that is everything that I'm willing to do today. Honestly, I'm so tired. But we have been live for an hour, and we've basically covered half of Theme 3, all of Theme 2. Take care, guys. I'm going to do some exam questions later. Have a great rest of your